It's great to welcome to the program today Timothy Snyder, historian, also author of the very interesting new book on freedom. I really appreciate you being here and the chance to talk about this today.
Looking forward to it.
You know, there's been an interesting reversal. We'll start with right now and kind of work backwards. There's
Sure.
been this very interesting reversal in the rhetoric around this presidential campaign, where Kamala Harris has, I would argue, succeeded rhetorically where other Democrats have failed in terms of taking back the narrative around what sorts of policies are really about freedom and liberty. And one of the things you talk about in the book is the responsibility that comes with freedom and kind of the contrast between the view of freedom as about individual rights versus a view of freedom that is more about the freedom of those in a society not to be bound by health insurance to a job they hate, as an example of the broader type of freedom. Do you think that this contrast in views about freedom that in the US plays out between Democrats and Republicans is fundamentally about individual versus maybe we describe them as societal rights? Or how would you couch that contrast?
So I don't think there's a contrast. That's where I would start. I think that you can't become an individual without other people. And like that's the baseline, right? So if you think you can become an individual on your own, imagine what would happen if you just left a child outside. And we all start as children, we all start as babies. Everybody needs other people to become free. Making it more political, we're all vulnerable to stories and we're all vulnerable to manipulation. And the only people who can help us with that are people we trust. If we don't trust anybody to criticize our views, then we are going to fall into somebody or other's authoritarian narrative. That's just the way it is. So, given that you can't be a free individual without other people, then the question becomes what kind of relationships are best for creating a society of free individuals? And so that's where government comes in. We don't need to have a welfare state, I don't think, because of equality, although equality is important for other reasons. We need to have a welfare state so that everybody has a chance to think, everybody has a chance to go on vacation, make friends, raise their families, that we all have a chance to become the kind of people we can become otherwise. So I would start it a different way. I don't think there's a clash between individual rights or social rights. I don't even know what social rights are. I do think I know what a free person is, and a free person can only become so with the help of other people. And then the job of government becomes creating the conditions in which we can help one another to become free.
The language that's often used to discuss this issue varies depending on what one's maybe priorities or biases are. I'll analogize to some other political issues, and then maybe you can talk to us about the language around freedom. There are political issues where I believe the language from the right is much more obviously appealing. Like, for example,
Mhm.
uh, unburdening people from taxes. Taxes are definitionally a burden. They restrict us because at the end of the day, it's our money and someone's taking it. The view on the left is not the opposite of that. It's, well, taxes are supposed to be there because we believe that there are some minimum services that are best provided. We're already kind of in the weeds. We don't have a simple
Mhm.
opposite to it's your money. That's it, period. I'm curious whether you think that there's an advantage to conservatives and libertarians with the language they use when they talk about freedom and liberty in contrast to how others might discuss it. Is the language part of maybe
Yeah.
why Republicans have better convinced people over the last 20 years that freedom lies with their elected officials?
Yeah, it's all a con, and it's a good con. And the only way to deal with a good con is to think about the ideas and talk to people. So the con is that freedom is negative. Freedom is just a matter of me doing what I want. And the only possible problem would be a barrier, like for example, a government that wants to take my money, and isn't that terrible? But that dodges the whole question because freedom is about who I really want to be and what I really care about and how I want to change the world. And so the moment that you say, well, freedom is just about the bad government, then yeah, it's like an easy rhetorical victory, but it doesn't have anything to do with freedom. Like that's where they have to lose. We can't have freedom without taxing rich people. It's just not possible. If you don't tax them, you're not going to have a free country. I mean, the history is 100% on one side of this question. If you let a few people get all the money and control all the wealth, you're not going to be in a free country. And one of the things that government is for is to make sure that the rich people get taxed. In America, it honestly doesn't really matter how much everybody else pays, right? That's another part of the scam. The real question is, are the oligarchs paying taxes? And the answer basically in one word is no. If they were, then the rest of us could have a lot of good stuff, which would lead to us being more free. So I think you have to start with it conceptually and say, well, being free is a matter of actually becoming yourself. And therefore, it's cool to have healthcare. It's cool to have roads. You're not going to be very free without roads. It's cool to have clean water. It's cool to have clean air. It's cool to have a good public school for your kid because all those things make it possible for you to do the stuff you actually want to do and be the person you actually want to be. And for that, yeah, you have to pay some taxes. But what really has to happen is that the people who are telling you this story about taxes, those people really have to pay taxes. And if they did, they wouldn't notice the difference because they're so incredibly wealthy anyway. But you would because suddenly you'd be living in a world where we would all be a hell of a lot freer.
There have some of those stories that are told. For example, Senator Rand Paul has said that if you have health care for everybody, it's essentially a form of slavery to doctors. The individual doctor has lost their freedom if they are, in a sense, conscripted to have to provide people health care. Now, of course, this completely ignores that when we talk about providing everyone access to health care, we're not talking about forcing any one doctor to treat any one patient or anything like that. But the attempt he's making is to say the individual freedoms are challenged by the societal responsibility, which in the book, if I understand the book correctly, you argue is not actually a contrast. It's not actually a clash. How would we address such a seemingly appealing to some people argument from somebody like Rand Paul, who considers himself a libertarian?
Yeah. I mean, libertarian, like if libertarianism really means that liberty is the value of values, then I'm a libertarian. But if you're going to really be a libertarian, that means you have to start with actual people and their actual lives. And actual people and their actual lives, they're all born and they all die and they all have health problems in the middle. And the health problems, as Jefferson and the founders and pretty much anybody with a head on their shoulders has recognized, are really, really inhibiting to freedom. So if you can create a world in which we are healthier, A, and less concerned about illness, B, you're creating a world in which we are all a lot more free. And frankly, this is palpable in countries which do have better health systems. It's palpable in places where you can just walk in the door and get healthcare and you don't have to worry about paying it. You know, it's palpable in a country like Germany where when the doctor says, I'm sorry, insurance doesn't cover this particular thing, you're going to have to pay 40 euros, right? It's like that's a different world and people feel differently. And the way that difference is, what is that difference? It is freedom, man. That is freedom. If you're not worried about it, you are free. So what you're looking at isn't like a dumb story like Rand Paul's, which of course he doesn't believe in. But that story is an opportunity for us to imagine just how much more free we all could be if sources of anxiety and sources of illness were taken away from us. We could live longer, richer, more relaxed, and therefore freer lives. As far as the individual doctors, there are plenty of cases around the world where healthcare is provided, and there are zero cases where doctors are made unfree by it, right? So, but there's a more fundamental thing here, which is that you got to, instead of thinking about like weird abstractions, you have to start with thinking about what life is actually like, right? Because people like Rand Paul, like at the end of the day, they want you to think that freedom is not about people. They want you to think it's about the market. They want us to owe duties to the market, but we don't owe duties to the market. The market is an abstraction. We're a social creation. It's not a person. We don't owe it any duties. We should organize the market so that we can be as free as possible. And it just so happens that that organization does not involve a situation in which investors are maximizing profits by monopolizing control of an ever smaller number of hospitals. That turns out to be a situation in which we're ever less free and live ever shorter lives. And once we know that, then we should act precisely in the name of freedom to make a better system.
I'd love to get your thoughts a little bit on the role of populist rhetoric over the last 10 plus years in shaping or sometimes perverting some of these discussions. I recently interviewed Federico Finkelstein, and he has written a lot about populist rhetoric. And one of the things I've talked about with my audience is that if you didn't know, for example, who Tucker Carlson and Bernie Sanders were, You could get a transcript of 60% of either of their speeches, and it would sound very similar in terms of the problem that they describe. You would then get to the other 40%, which might be how they would solve these problems or who they would blame for the problems. And all of a sudden, you would have a very big contrast. And so it seems to me that part of what has pulled in people to this populist rhetoric recently is that they really identify with some of what the problem is, but then all of a sudden they end up supporting folks where the solutions proposed are completely antithetical to the sorts of solutions they believe in. Do you think that that's accurate? Is there a lack of distinction in some sense between the rhetoric of populism, regardless of left, right, and then how do you think it's shaped discussions of this issue that you talk about in the book Freedom?
I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm imagining Bernie Sanders interviewing Vladimir Putin, and I can't help but think that like more than 60% of that would have been different had that
Yes, the interview would be different.
that
I'm talking more the rhetoric
I
about
know, I know.
the
I'm just
middle. Okay, yeah, yeah.
forgive me. I'm a Russianist, and like that wonderful counterfactual has now conquered my mind.
Yeah, no, that would be different.
That would, but so I'm going to start with populism
Yeah.
because I don't really know what it means. I don't really know what it means. I think that a lot of like populism, or maybe I'll just make your distinction in a different way. Like I think populists historically were people who said the government could do stuff for you, which I think is a reasonable view. I think that where, our Tucker Carlsons and our Donald Trumps and our JD Vances, Vance is actually the best example. Their view is that government is here in order not to do anything. Like government is helpless. What Vance offers is a kind of deliberate politics of impotence where we can't do anything. The only thing that can be done is for you to get angry at one another. And then that becomes a substitute or a new form, I would say, of politics. I wouldn't use populism here. I would use fascism.
Mm.
I think you have to use the big words that actually get some purchase on reality. The people who want to do away with government, except for government for their cronies and very rich people, and imagine that when in government, what they're going to do is get us to fight each other. And I mean that in a literal sense, like bloody, violent fights. Those people are the fascists. And I think those people are different from the people who say, um, we all suffering, we could all do something about it together. Right. So, I mean, I've never made it through a Tucker Carlson transcript. But so I can't really judge what you're saying. But I think there's a big like the notion that something is wrong is, of course, correct. From my point of view, what's wrong is that we're headed towards a global hydrocarbon-driven climate disaster, which is accelerated by incredible concentration of wealth in a few hands, and from which we are distracted by a very distorted social media setup in which we spend 7 hours a day in front of screens learning stuff basically which isn't true. Like I think there are overall structures which are wrong, and then there's a question of how do you diagnose that? I would diagnose it positively in terms of a lack of freedom. And I think the way that you argue for how government can change those things is in terms of freedom, right? So going back to your earlier question about the kind of libertarian trap, the negative definition of freedom says, yes, there are problems, but the problems are fundamentally government, or when you can't say that anymore, you say it's your immigrant neighbor, right? Whereas a positive definition of freedom says, hey, we can actually make things better. We know what's better, and we can use government to make things better. We can regulate social media. We can break up social media companies. We can solve problems with government, and as a result, we end up more free. So those are the distinctions that I would make. But please feel free to press me further if I'm missing something important.
No, I think you've addressed the main points of it. You mentioned the social media component of this, and I do want to drill down into that a little bit. How do you qualify exactly what it is about social media that's exacerbating this problem? Because there's the view that it's the format predisposes us to conflict over the 5% on which we disagree rather than the 95 where we agree. Or the algorithms are the problem because they reward extreme views and this shapes the Overton window, or fill in the blanks, right? There's all these different interpretations. What is it about social media that you think aggravates this problem?
Well, number one, it's dead and it's not alive. So I think we become freedom with the help of other people, other living people. We become freedom when we're challenged by their presence, or we're interested by their ideas, or we're attracted by their quirks, or whatever it might be. That's how we become free, is in the intersection between like the things that you actually care about and I actually care about, and then we have a conversation or whatever it might be. Whereas social media is dead. It's not alive. It's not another person. That's for me is the fundamental thing, that it's not alive, it's dead. And then the second thing would be it's an educational choice. So if we're spending, 7 hours a day in front of social media, that is 7 hours a day we're not spending with real people, or staring at trees, or reading books, or petting cats, or whatever other interaction we might have, right? Like there's this huge opportunity cost of other interactions. And I think those things come before what you asked, which is how exactly does it do it to us? I think we have to remember that that when we're on social media, we're looking into death, and that we're doing something instead of doing something else. And then we can ask how it's affecting us. The way it affects us, I think, fundamentally is that it drives us towards the fight or flight part of us, which is a real part of us, and away from the thoughtful consideration, self-control, choose values parts of us. And it's designed to do that. It's based on behavioralist experiments, which demonstrate how humans and other animals can be driven towards fight or flight, which is you give us things that we like, and then you interrupt it with things that we're afraid of, and then we like, and then afraid of. And that draws people in for whatever reason, and it changes them. It makes people more like that. It reinforces a certain way of being human, which is conflictual, and which is less capable of picking up on nuance and fact and being interested in difference. So for me, that would be the main thing. It's a big deal because the profit lines up with the behavioralism, lines up with the authoritarianism, or with the training of people to be authoritarian.
How would you regulate social media platforms? Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has put a big focus on the platform needs to know who you really are. It doesn't mean you can't post under a handle, for example, that's not your name,
Mhm.
but you shouldn't be anonymous completely so that there is some connection to responsibility. You're not just going to drive by and do horrible things. And if that was the case with everybody, it wouldn't fix everything, but that's like a specific thing that could be done to improve circumstances. What ideas do you have?
I mean, respectfully, I think that's good, but it's a little bit like picking the litter up from the lawn when the asteroid
Uh-huh.
is about to destroy the Earth. It like you need some collective effort to destroy that asteroid. It's not a kind of like picking up litter type problem. So that would be, I think I agree with that, but the 99.999% of the anonymous traffic on the internet is not Joe Schmo in Sioux City using a pseudonym. It's a
Right.
billionaire. It's billionaires with using engines to drive this stuff out, right? And so it would be nice if Joe Schmo used his real name, which happens to be, whatever. I'm like implicate. I don't want to implicate any real people by using names, but like it would be nice if people use their real names. But that they're not. The real problem is centralized, and so the real problem can only admit of a centralized solution. I would start with the question of, does social media have to exist in the form that it does? I don't think it does. We did just fine without it. In fact, we lived longer, happier, freer, better informed, more intelligent lives before it existed. And so I think that one should kind of start the question there rather than thinking of social media as like gravity. If you want to use a less radical analogy, one could think, well, what about the book and the printing press? The printing press almost tore us apart. A third of the people who lived in Europe died in a fairly direct series of events as a result of the printing press before we got to the book and copyright and all of that. So if it has to exist, let's imagine it existing in a form where which is calming and which is useful, and try to get to that form. But the third thing, and maybe the most important thing, is that it's not enough to regulate social media. We have to have the others. We have to actually have positive sources of factuality. So social media trains us into believing the stories which make us comfortable. And those stories don't really depend on facts in the world. And meanwhile, social media has sucked up the advertising revenue, which used to keep local newspapers going. And the result is that most people, I mean, most counties in America are now news deserts. Most of the territory in the US is not actually covered by a single human reporter, which means that there's a vacuum to be filled, and it has been filled. We have to think about this problem from the other side as well. What kind of regulatory setup, what sort of incentives would there have to be so that the whole country is reported? so that there are facts, basic facts, like facts about whether the water is polluted or whether the city councilman is corrupt. Those kinds of things, because those are the things that people need. They need that more than national news. They need that more than they need international news. They need it more than they need social media conspiracy theories. They need this sort of grounding. So the main thing for me would be to like to have some kind of mass rehabilitation of journalism, a bailout, right? Like we bailed out the banks, and we're still paying for it. We could, if we bailed out the journalists, the cost would be tiny compared to that, and the benefits would be tremendous. So that's a start.
I have a couple of chapters in my forthcoming book about critical thinking and media literacy as sort of antidotes to this. There's a really in that I cite a study by Pew where they had people simply say, this statement that you're putting in front of me is an opinion or it's a fact, right? Not evaluate the truth of the fact, just simply, are we talking about the category opinions or are we talking about the category facts? Republicans did worse than Democrats, but neither did particularly well and wrongly assessed opinions as statements of fact and vice versa. And
Mm.
it seems that at the educational level, we have a problem. I recently saw a video of media literacy class in Finland in Spanish. Okay, so we're two layers here where they've learned Spanish in the classroom to a degree that they can discuss media literacy in that language. It's mind-blowing if you see what isn't happening in fifth and sixth grade classrooms here that should be. And it seems that that's a higher order problem than Twitter's algorithm.
Yeah, it's all, I do think it's all related though. I mean, it's like when I think of the Finns, like they benefit from that because in the real, like this is a real world issue. So Finns who go through the Finnish educational system, they do much better. I mean, I just know this like as somebody who works on Eastern Europe, they do much better with the mess of disinformation around
Yes.
critical issues like the Russo-Ukrainian war than the rest of us do. But I mean, I mean, a simple way these things overlap is screens in the classroom. Why do we do it? Why did we do that exactly? The people who invented social media went to schools without screens in general. And in general, almost to a person, they keep their kids out of schools with screens and send their own kids to schools without screens. So why is it that we think that moving to screens into schools was a good idea? Or maybe like if you don't want to be so radical, why wouldn't we limit screens in schools to say computer programming class so that it's about the person gaining mastery over a thing rather than the thing gaining mastery over the person? We've let ourselves slip into this world where it just seems normal that there would be a screen everywhere. And we have to fight our way out. I mean, as a like I'm a university teacher, and so like I see I don't, and I'm in a very privileged position, but I see the difference every year, and you have to fight more and more to kind of create a little monastery type situation around your students so that they can actually learn. And this it goes to an even deeper thing, which is what freedom is, because if you just think freedom is negative, like it's just a matter of me like doing what I feel like in the moment, then staring at the screen for 24 hours a day and just kind of being bounced around emotionally or neurologically, that's freedom because you're following your impulses the whole time. Reflecting, criticizing yourself, having independent, unpredictable reactions to things, that's freedom. But you can't get that just by following your impulses. You can only get it from friends, family, education, other types of experiences, which then have to be consciously built into early life. So I'm kind of circling back to your point on education.
We've been speaking with Timothy Snyder. The new book is On Freedom. I really appreciate your time today and your insights, and really appreciate the book as well.
Thanks for saying so.